is a messy thing, and losing a war at the end of two fronts coming towards you while you're trying to salvage something, trying to keep your cool while all around you are losing their heads, it takes a special kind of man, or special kind of men. Men on a mission. Hans Kamla, Wilhelm Voss were two such men. General Patton was also on a mission. And in the final weeks of the war, politicians had let them down, and so did one American commander whose complete ignorance of the situation could actually have sped up the Cold War by a decade. It's time for me to fill in the blanks of what happened at the end of the war. Let's start with the Skodawerke in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. It is the key to the story. The Wallstein family founded the company in 1859, and Emil Skoda bought it in 1869. It soon established itself as Austria-Hungary's leading arms manufacturer. It produced heavy guns for the Navy, mortars, machine guns, and much, much more. Besides producing arms, Skoda also manufactured locomotives, aircraft, ships, machine tools, steam turbines, and equipment for power utilities. In 1899, the expanding business was transformed into a joint stock company, and before World War I, the Skodawerke had become the largest arms manufacturer in Austria-Hungary. It was also a navy and arms contractor, mainly supplying heavy guns and ammunition. Exports included castings, such as piping for the Niagara Falls power plant or the Suez Canal sluices, and much other machinery for sugar mills even in Turkey, breweries throughout Europe, and guns for the Far East and South America. You get the idea. It was a big business. Of course, initially after World War I had ended and the world was at peace leading into the recession, Skoda was not as busy making arms. However, that soon changed from the 1930s. Skoda was making some of the best battlefield cannons, artillery in Europe, including they produced a great tank, the LT-35, which, after the Germans took it over, used it successfully both in Russia and France, designated as 35T. In 1938, the Germans had annexed Austria, and now the Sudetenland, and then they crossed into the Czech fortified line without a shot was fired, something the American army would repeat 7 years later. The Skodawerke was handed over to the Germans in 1938, and the German state had, through its annexation of the Czech state, acquired a fourth of Skoda's shares. This ensured them a decisive influence over the company, and of course, as they had control over the country, they had control over Skoda. From 1939, these shares were handed to the Reichswerk Hermann Göring AG, thus incorporating Skoda under its umbrella. And with that came a strong influence of the SS and the corporation's management, research, and productions. The management now made up mostly of high-ranking SS officers, headed by SS Gruppeführer Dr. Wilhelm Voss. He was a prominent international arms dealer and businessman. Voss had convinced Himmler to bring the Skoda concern on par with the rest of the German armaments industry. This Himmler succeeded in convincing Hitler to do at the end of March 1942 by decree. With Skoda, the SS now had a strong bastion in the heavy weapons industry. Voss was relentlessly intelligent. He was the perfect SS elite type. And until shortly before the collapse, he was the powerful president of the Skoda armaments complex. However, on January 1945, he was fired by Hermann Göring for refusing to appoint two of the Reichsmarshal's envoys to management positions. However, Voss had made this the second largest arms maker in Europe, and he was very well liked by his Skoda colleagues and executives alike. Voss blended in perfectly, both with the elite of the international arms industry, whom he regularly had met with from before the war, on both sides of the Atlantic. With his flair for quiet diplomacy, Voss was immensely popular amongst the Czech executives who had remained in leading positions at the time of the German takeover of Skoda. Voss had even seen to it that the Czech workers were paid on the local, not the Reich wage scales, thus they were paid more money. Now, the careers of Hans Kamla and Voss overlapped here at Skoda, where they jointly set up and operated what is generally regarded by insiders as the Reich's most advanced high-technology military research center. Working as a total independent, undercover operation for the SS, the center was under the special auspices of Himmler and Kamla. The group's research went far beyond that Skoda already produced, and it worked closely with Krupp and was concerned with analysis of captured equipment, including aircraft, and copying and improving the latest technical features. In doing so, the SS group was to go beyond the first generation of secret weapons. They were researching and developing new technologies, everything from remote-controlled rockets to that of the nuclear sphere, and much, much more. How the SS structured their research, I'll break down in later episodes. Hans Kamla was the youngest of the two men, and he was regarded by many in the Nazi hierarchy to be the most powerful man in Germany outside the cabinet. He rose from a relative's obscure position of a construction engineer for the Luftwaffe into a top-level troubleshooting position for both Hitler and Himmler. By the end of the war, Hitler had concentrated more power to Kamla than he had ever entrusted any other single other person, or as far as I know, to any other individual has ever achieved in any country since. He even gave him authority to arrest anyone, regardless of rank, who interfered with the execution of any orders he had issued. Kamla had won his spurs by a long run of successes and by realizing never tried seemingly impossible projects at speeds not before thought possible. His high academic rating of Doctor Engineer was also a valuable asset in the 1930s and served as a door opener to industry, the services, and a party career. Himmler had piled assignment after assignment upon him and brought him into Hitler's presence at every opportunity, and the rumor was that Himmler was trying to build up Kamla to be Speer's successor. Thus, Speer, praising Kamla's ability and talent, still with a bitter note of past rivalries, still praised him, he did. The same was said about Walter Dornberger, head of the rocket program at Peenemünde, who desperately had tried to remain in control of the rocket program that was eventually also handed over to Kamla. In Germany there was a saying at the time, if you can't reach Himmler, you can't reach Pohl, try Kamla. As time went on, the SS brass in Germany and those abroad had made it a habit to keep on good terms with Kamla, as he was generally seen as the man of the hour. I always did like the analogy that if Kamla had been born in Egypt back in its heyday, he would have been the one who had built the pyramids for the pharaohs, except he would have done it twice as fast. He was ambitious, exceptionally diligent, and hard-working. Grothmann, Himmler's aide, would later after the war wonder how Kamla had managed to do everything he did. Also, he had a family with children, and by all accounts he was a loving father, and he had joined the party early and even fought for the Freikorps, so his credentials were impeccable. As the war was turning, Kamla had expressed privately that he felt it was his dream of saving Germany with his technology. Thus, that explains part of his drive. And with the final days in sight, Kamla did not slow down. But knowing the war was lost, he must now have been operating out of a new plan. One that lets both men, he and Voss, back to the Czechoslovakian Republic, followed by Patton's army, almost surrounded by the Russians. And with that came one of the greatest military cock-ups and great personal tragedy, and one of mystery. In 1945, the Allied armies were 60 miles from Berlin. The German lines were known to be thinly held, but suddenly, all these fancy OSS reports began to float about the German southern redoubt, Nazi holdout in the mountains, a German last stand. And all the previous plans to take Berlin was suddenly changed. And now all the military units headed south towards Czechoslovakia. But the OSS may have known the redoubt story was not credible, or worse was, By some last-minute political dealings, the area of Thuringia, taken in heavy fighting and losses by the U.S. Army, was now to be handed over to the Russians, much to the dismay of both soldiers and the Americans back home. And this, an area we know well, that was so full of German special research, rockets, jet productions, it was all located here. So why was this allowed? Indeed, after the war, there seems to be some embarrassment for Eisenhower to have neglected to take Berlin and failed to warn of the Russians' greater intent at the time and after the war, which was already clear by now to most. The Russians had even clearly stated that he who held Berlin held the keys to Europe. So the decision to not take Berlin must be said to be a rather magnificent blunder, lamented by everybody ever since. But it gets a lot worse. So why were the Allied armies diverted towards the east, and exactly on what intelligence? What was there besides Prague, the Czech capital that was just like Berlin, a very prestigious capital and a target? We all know that all intelligence agencies talk to each other behind the scenes. The NKVD, the OSS, the British intelligence, and obviously parts of German intelligence, they all had channels of communication. So who deceived whom to get the entire Western effort to change course away from such an important target as Berlin, and why? Either the U.S. messed it up and brought the whole redoubt story truthfully, or the NKVD floated the info to deceive the Allies deliberately to get them away from Berlin, which they wanted, or it was made clear to the U.S. that there was something more important in the East than there was in Berlin, justifying such a strategic change. Now, Allen Dulles, who was later to become the head of the CIA, was stationed in Zurich. He was coordinating efforts from there. He was in contact with the SS General Wolf, who later gave up Italy, and I think quite possibly he had been the one to reach out to General Kammler as well, as early as 1944. It was said early that U.S. intelligence had reached out to him at that time, as well as Himmler had reached out to them. As Speer clearly recalls Kamla telling him on April 3rd he intended to surrender the rocket scientists to the Americans, the same day that he ordered all the rocket scientists moved from Nordhausen to Oberammergau in Austria, away from the Russian advance. And on that same day, Kamla had offered Speer to join him. He had admitted that the war was lost, and Speer also told investigators afterwards that Kamla had alluded to a SS plot to get rid of Hitler, and that contact had indeed been made by the Americans. This change now brought the Americans to Nordhausen first, Kamla's prize rocket factory in the mountains, and to Jonasthal as well, and led them onwards to Skodawerke and to the Bergkristall tunnel system in Linz, Austria, before the Russians got to any of these important sites. And Kamla had ordered that Nordhausen was to remain intact and handed over to the Americans as such, yielding the known greatest technical scoop of the war. And when I say known, I mean that we know of. There are miles and miles of underground factories and laborers. The laborers had been evacuated already, but everything was intact for the Americans to take. Also the secret sites in Jonasthal, where there were some strange movements of American military as they took that area, and along with Diebner's reactor in Stadilm. All of it was handed over, although Diebner and a small SS group had left with what was key materials before the Americans got there, hiding them away, just like von Braun and Dornberger had done so with their rocket papers, until they know they had a solid deal with the Americans. After visiting the Nordhausen site, General Hap Arnold wrote, "We are very much behind in this development, and if we do not take the opportunity to seize this equipment and the men who developed it, we will lose many precious years." In an interesting move, earlier Kammler had appointed Gerhard Debenkolb as his head of Me-262 production, de facto leaving him free to do other things. It seems that Kamla had no plans of returning to Berlin, ever. Nor had he any plans of actually busying himself with the production of jets himself, as he usually would have done. But the last couple of months of the war, he knew where things were going, and he needed to free himself for other things. The 600 scientists arrived in Oberammergau around April 22nd. Stayed at the Jesus Christi Hotel. Kamla was according to a U.S. report in Berlin on April 23rd. This was based on a phone call from here to Grosz, who was in Prague, for him to order a special SS unit in Berlin to destroy something designated as V1. But we also know from Werner Grodman of the double designations of special weapons for camouflage purposes. But I asked myself, why would Kamla, if he was in Berlin, just not pass on this order to the special SS squad to make this destruction himself? Why would he call Grosz all the way in Prague to have him contact the same people in Berlin? It gets worse. Dornberger was now arrested by Himmler on the 22nd of April. Kamla races to get him out, and he and Kamla both travel onto the border near Innsbruck, where Dornberger later surrendered on May 2nd. Thereafter, Kamla's adjutant claims Kamla was in Ebensee on May the 2nd to the 5th. Kamla had already from mid-April started ignoring Himmler's orders, and at this point in May, Himmler was stripped of all his offices and Göring was under house arrest. This was a time of chaos. Hitler was surrounded in Berlin and not going to get out. The war was lost, Kamla knew it, and he was making other plans. In fact, in April, Kamla had made it a point to meet with all his key people. Orders went out. He was tying up loose ends and making preparations for the future. His family was safe, and now he was headed where? He could simply have stayed with Dornberger or with the scientists and surrendered with them on the 7th, but he did not. However, it wasn't until May 21st that the deals for the German scientists were sealed and signed that the Americans were handed the 14 tons of documents that had been hiding and now was on their way to the U.S. Skodawerke, 40 miles inside Czech territory, and Field Marshal Schröner was just still holding on, keeping the Russians at bay east of Prague. He would not surrender until 2 days after the armistice. Yet it was clear to all that Czech would fall under Russian control, and would remain so. And it was clear to both Voss and Kamla that the Skodawerke and its research staff, the Kamla-Stab, would fall to the Russians eventually. The same of all the other special research programs, such as the one under SS Hauptsturmführer Rolf Engel, that was housed in Pribram, not far from Prague, but more on him in a minute. But I will tell you, if I had been Himmler, my bet for all the special research programs would have been on Engel, not von Braun. Yet most of you have not heard of this very brilliant rocket engineer that rose through the rocket ranks with von Braun, yet he was a dedicated party man and anti-communist. However, early May, there are millions of refugees and Germans fleeing west away from the advancing Russians. The roads in Czechoslovakia were clogged with westbound traffic. There were battles all around, and there was great danger to anybody in German uniform. Both Kamla and Voss went east, yet separately. On May 3rd, Bradley had given Patton the green light for crossing into Czechoslovakia from Austria, where they had just found the Berchtesgaden tunnels also intact. On the 4th, Patton advanced with 500,000 men on several prongs, passing the Czech fortified lines toward Germany. Mostly no shots were fired once again, and they rolled into Pilsen and the Skodawerke, which was taken by Combat Command B3 Armored, the same unit who had captured Nordhausen with all its riches and valuables in technology. That will soon open up to a whole lot more questions. Eisenhower advised Moscow that he would advance further as there was no Russian troops within 70 miles between Patton and Prague. Patton wanted to take Prague, obviously, and his advance elements had already gone ahead. They had unofficially been moving ever since dawn. The Czech underground resistance signaled that they would hand over the capital to the Patton, but Stalin made Eisenhower halt all U.S. troops just east of Pilsen. Patton had to refuse to help the Czechs liberate Prague. So on May 5th, the Prague underground rose against the Germans and signaled once again for the Americans to help. The Germans were now trying to fight and retake the city, fighting in the streets. Prague, just like Berlin, was left to the Russians. Schröner's men were keeping the Russians at bay, while inside the city, German men and women were killed and hung from lampposts and set on fire. Street fighting. Patton could only look on 70 miles to the west. Yet part of his advance units did unofficially make it to the outskirts of Prague, and the German units began to stream west to surrender to them, or at least make it into Austria and surrender to the Americans there. Knowing the Skodawerke would be handed over to the Russians, the US and British experts now began digging through the research projects of the know-how at Skoda, both of weapons making, their turnkey water turbine plants, and much more.
Air Force heavies smashed Pilsen, Czechoslovakian supply point for the Austrian redoubt, where it was expected the Nazis would attempt the last stand. Battering these marshalling yards prevented vital shipment of materiel from Pilsen, last heavy industry area left to the Germans. 500 heavy bombers, escorted by 500 fighters, beat through intense ack-ack to produce this bomb damage. The Skoda armament works at Pilsen, seized by Hitler in March of 1939, was a prime target. This Goering-controlled armament plant made all kinds of guns, ammunition, bombs, mines, tanks, and armored cars. The plant, third largest in Nazi Germany, sprawled over 320 acres and employed 30,000 workers.
It is at this time uncertain if the American teams there were even aware of the secret SS research staff, the Kamla staff, that was housed there. The Russians seemed somewhat better informed, as they deliberately went and took Engels and Pribram, but they did not manage to take Pilsen because Schröner's forces held them at bay. But throughout the war, lots of SS and other units had set up shop in Czechoslovakia. Himmler had already in 1942 set up a Waffen-SS liaison staff to the Skoda and Bremen weapons manufacturing factory, and the general management offices of Skoda, and he set it up in Prague, with Voss in charge. By now, it was becoming clear that the Russians were going to have things their way, in face of a very weak Western leadership and their constant appeasement of the Russians. This was also apparent to the Czech workers at Skoda, and they now actively opposed all attempts by the Allies to obtain documents and information, having hidden most drawings and plans from them. And possibly the U.S. bombing of the Skodawerke and Pilsen probably did not help matters there either. And the word still is that the Allies had not penetrated the SS think tank security, so maybe they did not know at all. And here was only the SS who had access to sensitive information and plans. But for months, the Czech staff in Pilsen refused to cooperate and hand over any information to the Allies. It all went to the Russians. And the plant produced high-quality weapons for the Russians for decades after. But what happened to Kamla and Voss? On May 10th, among the now clogged roads full of refugees and military, Voss was making his way back towards Skoda. He was intent on saving the secret plans and having them handed over to the Americans. He knew that there were things that if they fell in the hands of the Russians, they would pose a grave future threat to the West. Voss had made his decision on May 6th when he knew that the Americans had taken the city. Later he expressed hope that Kamla would also have made his way there for the same reason. Kamla we had not seen since May 5th in Austria. Certainly, nor Kamla or Voss would have fared very well if they had been caught by Czech resistance or partisans, Russians or American military, and they were both marked for automatic arrest by pretty much everybody. Still, there are several eyewitnesses putting Kamla in Prague. Of course, most of them were by his most trusted associates, so I take that with a grain of salt. Voss, however, went to the Skodawerke, and he was received quite well. He was quite surprised at the much damage the American bombing had caused. He now discovered that the same Skoda executives he had worked with were now changing their loyalties to their new pending Russian masters. But he needed help from somebody he knew. Fortunately, he found a few of the members of the SS counterintelligence group there. They had maintained their undercover identity and had, independently of orders, had the same idea and had begun to pack away in one truck all the secret designs, put them in cases marked personal and payroll, a truck full of secret weapons plans. Voss went to see the American officer in charge, to tell him what he had and to take the truck to the American zone. However, this officer simply refused. His orders were to hand over the plant to the Russians, and that's what he was going to do. For hours on end, Voss pleaded with him, explaining what secrets was in this truck, citing who he was as an international arms dealer, knowing how important this was for future U.S. military and weapons manufacturing. And at this very minute, the U.S. were currently clearing out Nordhausen's rocket plant for the very same reason. Now, if this was the same soldiers that had taken Nordhausen, somebody surely would have known and understood the importance of this. However, this officer was ignorant. And indeed, spiting a directive that had been issued by the Joint Chiefs directing all U.S. military personnel to preserve from destruction and take under personal control all records, plans, and notes of German research. However, the officer in charge at Pilsen couldn't care less. Did not care about SS secret research. He even refused to contact an intelligence unit, as is prescribed in such matters. Years after the war, Voss still related how furious he was that this American officer would display such criminal stupidity. And one wondered who this man really was. I don't have his name, but I'm sure he was promoted several more times. Voss remained at the Skodawerke for 2 more days, trying in various ways to get this truck out. And on the 12th, the handover to the Russians began. And one last effort by the SS security team tried to drive it over to the American motor pool. It failed, as an American MP saw them and waved them back. This caught the eyes of the Russians, who stopped the truck, and upon opening the first crate, marched all the men off, with Voss silently watching by at a distance, knowing he had failed. Now he also witnessed the Czech members of the Kamla stab. They all entered long row of staff cars, all people he had known well, worked with, men who recognized him but remained quiet, all headed off to the east to work for the Russians. Voss's family lived in Votis, east of Pilsen. It was now time for him to get his family and get out, and he headed there, but he was detained by Czech police officers who had been notified he was there. The police officers regrettably had to inform him his entire family had been murdered by anti-German partisans at their home in Votis. He had also at this time been informed that General Kammler had committed suicide on the 9th. One of his many suicides, Voss was eventually handed over to the Americans. After interrogation, Voss was set free, yet he was consulted several times on matters of arms production and special research projects, and gave testimony at Nuremberg. In 1951, the British and Egyptian relations had broken down. The Egyptians could no longer buy arms from the British. And Nasser had reached out to the CIA for aid in setting up their new military structure, something the CIA could not officially be part of, so they pegged Reinhard Gehlen, former head of Fremdesheers East. He was now the intelligence head of the West German intelligence under Adenauer, of course appointed and aided to that position by the CIA, Allen Dulles. They and Adenauer fully backed Voss as the man to head up the new collaboration between the countries, Germany-Egypt. Voss flew to Cairo with then General Muhammad Naguib, and Voss was back in his old business, backed by CIA in Germany, and Voss recruited 200-some members from the Skoda expert team to join him there. Also, he was joined by some of Rommel's generals and a lot of SS men and army officers. Otto Skorsena was among them. This effort was, by the way, coordinated by Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, the former president of the Reichsbank. He's the one that funded Hitler's Reich plans. Business had resumed as ever before. But what happened to Kamla? Well, let's start from the end and work our way backwards. On May 7th, a document labeled Top Secret was couriered back to the US, stating clearly that Kamla had surrendered on May 6th with several others. He was wearing an army uniform, but his identity had been proven and the CIC officer had his documents. And that Kamla was now being transported back towards Nordhausen and was preparing a detailed report for the investigators. Something they had suggested he do, not ordered him to do. Now, there are multiple accounts that Kamla went from Austria to Prague, again, all by people who he knew well and could have trusted to keep his secret. And why would Kamla go to Prague? He already had the rocket team, he had rescued Dornberger, everything was being handed over to the Allies, and if this was his bargaining chip, including the documents of all the rocket research, then that was pretty much it. Why go to Prague? Why risk being captured or killed? Well, there's something else in Prague. Besides all the paperwork that must have been stored at the secret research facility's headquarters in Prague, but Sturmbannführer Grosch was there, and certainly he could have taken care of that. There was something else. There was another research team that was operating parallel and exclusively under the SS. This was run and operated by Hauptsturmführer Rolf Engel. Him you'll hear a lot more about in a moment. But Alan Dulles should have known about the Kamla group in Skodawerke, and clearly the officer in charge of capturing the Skodawerke was clueless and uninformed as to capturing special research. It couldn't possibly have been a surprise to the Allies of just how important Skodawerke really was. It was so important, in fact, that the Germans built an entire mock-up of the factory 3 miles outside of town in order to fool the Allies from aerial bombardment. That says a little bit about how important it was to the Germans as well. It may have been missed, but even if Kamla had done a deal, he might not have told the OSS about everything he was bringing to the table just yet, and needed to recover and possibly hide some more aces in the hole before surrendering. And if Kamla had gone to Pilsen, he and his men would have evacuated that truck before the Americans got there, I am quite certain. So I'm contending that Kamla did not go to Pilsen, however, possibly he went to Prague, where he supposedly met with several key figures and set up transfer of key documents, handed them to someone like SS Oberführer Emil Klein, who was the head of the Pioneer School not far out by Mitnick Hill. Also a location where Rolf Engel was later seen in those last days. Now Klein, he made it out to Austria, as did Engel. Now we do know for a fact that there were key research documents to be hidden, to be destroyed, or to be recovered. And we do know that Kamla surrendered to the US Army, although we do not know exactly where. And still, a few years later, while Kamla's wife had him declared dead, papers were flying around between the British and the US offices as to how to best utilize Kamla, requests for interrogations, extraditions, denials, and approvals, all the way up to 1949, where his file was closed, officially. The rocket scientists were eventually moved to the U.S., united, working for the Americans. Even Fiebinger was in the U.S. by 1948, officially working on building missile silos. So what happened to the other documents from Pribram and Prague? And who was SS Hauptsturmführer Rolf Engel? For this, we need to talk to a Czech specialist in aeronautic research and history, one who wrote a book on Engel and his research, a book we very much look forward to being published in English. Very few people heard of this. Even today, they hardly ever speak of it. In here, behind these walls, some of the most secret research of the entire war took place. So secret, we still today do not know what most of it was.
This building is former mining university in Pribram. During the Second World War, world, Czech universities were closed by Nazi Germany, and this building was in fact common research institute of Skodawerke Plzeň and Zbrojovka Brno. It was such a nucleus of later Versuchsanstalt Pribrams, which was created in December 1944 when the Research Institute of Roll, Engel, was resettled here from Hel Peninsula in nowadays northern Poland. So and this building was really the headquarters for all of the research projects which were made by German and Czech scientists. As I said before, one of most influential projects in my eyes was, for example, project V101, or in German V101 rocket project. It was a really huge rocket with estimated velocity of 2,000 kilometers per hour. This rocket should reach the altitude of 200 kilometers and should have a range of 1,800 kilometers. It was really the big rocket. The estimated weight was 140 tons, from which 100 tons was only the fuel.
Did they ever get to any kind of construction planning, or was it just paper?
Here it was really, majority of this project was left only on the papers, but some construction models here in the workshop was as well created. As far as I know, so after the World War II, here they were founded. After the war, for example, in the workshop were founded some the wooden models of anti-aircraft rocket weapons, and even of some rocket type torpedoes for Navy. After the war it was closed, the Czech, this institute was closed. The Czech scientists came back to their employees as Škoda Plzeň, Zbrojovka Brno, and this building once again was re-erected as mining university.
Now, Rolf Engel was a smart man. He'd completed his engineering apprenticeship, and he studied at Technical University of Munich and University of Danzig. Engel had known Werner von Braun since 1928. Engel worked on the development of rockets during the Weimar Republic. Together with von Braun and other rocket pioneers, he worked out the basics of rocket technology in the 1930s, and rocket airfield founded by Rudolf Nebe in Berlin-Reckendorf. He then worked for the rocket engineer Johannes Winkel, who developed the first European liquid rocket and launched it in Dessau in February 1931. December 1932, he founded the Rocket Research Institute in Dessau together with Hans Springer and with the participation of Hugo Junkers. From 1930 to 32, he was a member of the Association of Space Travel, VFR. Some members of the VFR approached the Red Army as part of German-Soviet military cooperation. Rolf Engel offered to bring a team of rocket developers to the Soviet Union. Engel was for some reason imprisoned in 1933 and fell afoul with the army, thus Dornberger. He joined the SS and achieved the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer. Engel headed the SS Rocket Research Facility for jet propulsion in Großdorf near Danzig. He was a member of the Reichsresearch Council and a venomous for the rest of his life anti-Soviet and communist. And interestingly enough, as things tie together, after the war, Engel built rockets first for the French, and then he started his own company. And guess what? Then he joined Wilhelm Voss Group in Egypt, making weapons and rockets in the Middle East, with all his former colleagues from the Second World War. And of course, the CIA get taps on them all because, well, they were instrumental in setting them up in business there in the first place. It gets better. After Egypt, both of them ended up in the German space program.
Right now we are in central Bohemia in a town named Pribram. Pribram is very interesting. Here was the mining university. The Czechoslovakia, or in that time occupied so-called protectorate Bohemia and Moravia, was really very important for Nazi industry, because it was industrially one of the most developed countries in Europe. And there was several leading factories where a lot of weapons from hand grenades to tanks were made. And two of these leading factories, one is situated in Plzeň, named Skoda, it's in Western Bohemia, and second one in Brno. It's the capital of Moravia, and this is Zbrojovka Brno, or in German, Waffen Union Brno. These two big and leading factories has own development and research institute even before World War II. It was for the necessary of the Czechoslovak army. And these two research institutes were during the Second World War submerged in one institution to make the calculation to work on project for Nazi Germany. And it was settled here in Pribram, in the free space in the former and right now closed mining university. This was such a nucleus for the further research and even research in rocketry. And this was one part of the big programs because in fact the Czechoslovakia wasn't in the interwar period during the World War II most involved in some rocket research or something like that. But the situation was really changed in December 1944. In that time, when the Red Army was advancing to the nowadays northern Poland. So in the December 1944, one of the German rocket research institutes situated in nowadays town Vladislavovo on the Lechel Peninsula, it was decided to resettle this institute before advancing Red Army to the Bohemia. And it was as well decided to submerge this institute, which was led by SS Hauptsturmführer Rolf Engel. And it was some 10 or 15 German scientists, and it was submerged with this institute of Czech scientists in the mining university here in Pribram. So it was created the base, and they continue in the rocket research. And it was mainly anti-air defense rockets. They were rocket type torpedoes for the Navy. It was some other things as improvement of anti-tank unguided missiles as M8 or A4M Panzerblitz, which was done here. And because nearby of the Pribram was a military training ground, in the special artillery training ground, so these missiles were tested nearby of Pribram. It was one of the reasons why this Rocket Research Institute were settled here. It was done some really very important rocket research projects, but a lot of them were left only on the papers, and only the calculations were made and nothing else. But some of these projects were really very interesting. A couple of days before end of the World War II, all the German scientists from Pribram fled to Bavaria, where they were captured by US Army. It is a really very interesting thing and point of view, because before it they destroyed all of the research material and all of the models and everything, and only really very few things were left here in Pribram. The most interesting is another story, because among the German scientists who were captured in Bavaria was a Swede scientist Niels Werner Larsson. He was Rolf Engel deputy, as deputy head of this institute, and he was a really very clever person. And his human story is almost unbelievable. He gave the testimony to US intelligence officer about the project which were calculated here in Pribram, and it was one other thing really very interesting, that even 15 years after the war, it was released that in fact this Swede Niels Werner Larsson, who voluntarily joined the Nazi research program and came to Nazi Germany from neutral Sweden in 1942, was in fact the agent of British and US secret services. And with the help of Otto Skorseny, one of the leading and as well colorful figure of Nazi regime, he joined the Nazi rocket research program and came to this function. But it could be his end. So after the war, he gave testimony to US intelligence and everything is clear. But not so. Because when the Niels Werner Larsson came from Sweden, from the neutral Sweden to Nazi Germany in 1942, he bring with him some Sweden secret military project to impress the Germany. So it was functionable. So after the war in 1945, he was sentenced into life imprisonment in Sweden for dealing with Sweden military secrets. But for other 15 years, we didn't know much on him. In 1960, Niels Werner Larsson appeared in Western Berlin and gave the testimony in the US embassy that he worked as a secret US spy for almost 15 years in Soviet rocket program. Of course, after 15 years after the war, and most probably he didn't have any contact with some intelligence officer in Soviet Union, so nobody believed him. And Niels Werner Larsson was so confused that he appointed some press conference where he would like to explain everything what he saw during his work on the Soviet cosmic and rocket program. This press conference should be held in Hamburg in 1960, but the really couple of hours before, Niels Werner Larsson once again escaped. He was missing. So what we now the most probably the US Secret Service understood that he was a really their spy. And before not dealing with really secret information on Soviet rocket program, he was secretly shipped to US, where lived under some cover name until his death. So it is just really international stories on what's hidden in the Czech history. So Rolf Engel was as well the really colorful person. So what we know, after the Second World War, he was worked for a French rocket program, and from the French he fled to the Egypt. And then for Nasser make once again, as many of German Nazi scientists, he developed their rocketry. Rolf Engel was really involved in the German rocketry before World War II. He collaborated with such persons in German rocketry as Hermann Oberth. And it seems that he chose some own way, and that's why he was separated from this mainstream in a Nazi rocketry, as was headed by SS Brigade Führer Kammler. This submerged institute, where both the German and Czech scientists were, so was funded at the last months of the war from the funds of Škoda Plzeň, Zbrojovka Brno, and some other factories as Explosia 17. Because basically this private research institute was mainly for use of this big factories. It was Škoda Brno, Škoda Plzeň, Zbrojovka Brno, Explosia 17. Explosia 17, it was a leading factory in Bohemia for production of explosives. The Kamla came here. He in fact was an employer of this so-called Waffen Union Brien Research Institute. But on the other hand, he was he worked independently, and nobody knows on what he's working. But it's really interesting one thing, after World War II, the Czechoslovakia in fact didn't continue in some rocket research. They didn't. But it's interesting that in a range some 3-4 years after the war, the former Czech scientists from this Pribram Research Institute patented some project as liquid and hybrid rocket fuel.
Wonder where they got that idea from.
Oh, well, we can put just this information, because of course everybody would say, okay, this is former Nazi research project, but maybe they really made it in their way. Most probably the Soviet intelligence really didn't know about this institute. And what was left after it, were took by Czech scientists to Škoda Plzeň and to Zbrojovka Brno.
After the war?
After the war.
So
immediately after the war. yet in May 1945. And we continually starting to research and developing in and collected information. Then we released that other documentation of this Rocketry Research Institute in Pribram is preserved in an archive in the Skodawerke. So, and we collected all the material together, but what is really interesting in the Czech archive, they are particularly no mentions on this research project. Only the Niels Werner Lardner testimony to US intelligence made in May 1945 in Bavaria made us more information what was developed here. This research institute, which have several departments as chemistry, physics, ballistics, explosive, fuel. So there were a lot of improvements, and for example, one of them was an improvement of German unguided missile A4M, named Orkan or Panzerblitz. And this was really produced by Zbrojovka Brno, or during the occupation Waffen Union Brno.
As I suspected, some of the German scientists who was working for the Skodawerke and for Wolf Engel's team had left Czechoslovakia before the Russians got there. It makes sense that since they met up with the Americans, they also had brought out their documents with them, and since they were all under the command of the SS, they would de facto be under the command of General Kamla. Wolf Engel also made it out, but he made it out through Metnik Hill at the SS Pioneer Camp, where he met up with Emil Klein right after having been handed the last documents for some of the secret research projects. These disappeared. And there was a lot of special projects that needed to be tied up in Czechoslovakia before the end. And another interesting point is, what actually did happen to Koch? Did he ever leave Prague and come meet up with Kamla? Well, rumor after the war has it that he was killed in Ebensee, but nobody really knows what happened to him or where he went, and no body's been found to my knowledge. What exactly had Kammler got to do with the Pioneer School and the specific constructions he had ordered Emil Klein to undertake in the years leading up to the end of the war? And a hypothesis is building in my head, quietly to myself, that maybe Kamla never went to Prague. The only people who said they saw him there were all his closest associates. There's 14 different accounts of his death or suicide or murder, and yet none of them are verified. No body's ever been found. The Americans admitted on the 6th that they had captured him and that he was in custody, and this paperwork trail continued way up to 49. So with good conscience we can say that Kamla most definitely went to the US. Privately, in the back of my mind, for that last month of what we know Kamla was doing, I think he was building up to do something. He was tying off loose ends, making orders, making sure everything was done and lined up for the pending collapse of the Third Reich and for the future. What is fairly certain is that he most certainly did not die. Why didn't he just stay with the rocket scientists and surrender with them? Have Koch bring all the papers from Prague, send over the SS team earlier to Pribram or to Skodawerke and merge all the paperwork, hand everything over to the Americans. There's another reason why he disappeared. He had even sent his family off to meet with him on the 6th, somewhere else, but in safety. I think there might have been one more loose end Kamla needed to handle before surrendering. But of that, I can only tell you the details later this year when I have been confirmed right or wrong. But this is far from where the story ends in Czechoslovakia. In a small town called Strasovice, which you may have heard about, because ever since the war it has been the site of an ungodly amount of strange excavations, treasure hunts, and others, all related back to Emil Klein and possibly Rolf Engel and Hans Kamla. Now, Kamla was in charge of the special projects and the building and construction for the SS. He had no general contact or reason to give orders to the fighting units or those such as the Pioneer School, yet during the war he gave very special instructions for Emil Klein to have things constructed and built around this site. Things that could be, or have been ever since, construed as hiding places or secret underground bunkers. Also, a large hydroelectric dam that had been begun constructing before the war was now suddenly a high priority for Kamla to have finished, and yet no one can tell me exactly where the electricity that was produced here were actually to go. Seemingly it was never rerouted up to the nearby city of Prague. So, with all these strange occurrences, all these excavations, strange companies coming in the middle of the night, excavating sites, and one special secret mission right after the war ended in 1946 that could have risked the Cold War turning hot already then, a small U.S. force crossed the territory under premise of something else and excavated one of these sites and retrieved something. It was a location that Emil Klein had constructed hastily towards the end of the war, but none of the papers that Rolf Engel had been handed just before the same place was among those that had eventually been returned. In either case, it's time for me to go out to Mednik Hill and take a look myself at what is actually there. What does this forest look like? Where was the SS Pioneer Camp? What is this huge dam doing? And the secret hiding place that was found in 46 by U.S. bomb squad and more. There's a lot of stories, a lot of rumors, a lot of fantastic accounts of gold trains and what have you. I'm going to try to sort through some of the gossip, the rumors, talk with some of the locals that live there and historians, and take a look for myself and show you what exactly this place looks like, and then we'll go from there.
This is a beautiful place. There's deer in the woods looking at me. And something in here is so sinister that people are both worth killing and dying for it.
Behind me is Werner von Braun's first test stand. Down the road is Dietmar's nuclear reactor. Over there is the Maginot Line and all its amazing forts. I'm visiting them all and I'm bringing them to you. So I really appreciate you like, follow, and share what I'm doing, trying to document all these important historical locations. And if you feel like you want to watch more pictures or documents that are used for these, go to lostbattlefields.com. And if you feel like helping me out with my travels, because gasoline and travel and airfare is expensive, my PayPal is there, protectionserviceint.com. You are more than welcome, but you don't have to. I appreciate all your support and all your help, and I love seeing these locations, and I love bringing them to you.